A very warm welcome to you, sir. Good morning, everybody else. Since there are quite a few people here already, I would like to just go through the guidelines that are mentioned here in case anybody missed out on them. So firstly, the audience is requested to keep their microphones switched off throughout the session. Please make sure to use the chat box in case you have any questions for the speaker. Kindly send your questions to the questions moderator. The audience is encouraged to turn on their cameras if possible. Kindly do that. Everyone is expected to maintain decorum during the lecture. In order to unmute or ask questions, please use the raise hand feature upon which you would be prompted to unmute. I hope all of these are clear. With that being said, I would like to move on to Ms. Malika Mandal for the introduction. Over to you, Malika.
Hey, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the flagship event of the Economic Society of St. Stephen's College, the National Economics Festival. This fine morning, we are absolutely privileged to have with us none other than Dr. Raghuram Rajan. Dr. Rajan currently serves as the Catherine Dusac Miller Distinguished Service Professor of Finance at the Chicago Booth School of Business. He was the 23rd Governor of the Reserve Bank of India between September 2013 and September 2016. Between 2003 and 2006, Dr. Rajan was the Chief Economist and Director of Research at the International Monetary Fund. He also served as the Chief Economic Advisor in the Ministry of Finance in the year 2012 to 2013. Dr. Rajan's research interests are in banking, corporate finance, and economic development, especially the role finance plays in it. He has written multiple award-winning books and received many accolades in banking, finance, and economic sciences. Today, he desired to speak on the intersection between politics and economics. Along with Rohit Lamba, he has recently begun working on a series of articles on why India's economic future cannot be separated from its politics and sociology. On the same lines, he will be speaking on the topic, why politics matters for economics today. We are extremely grateful to you, sir, for giving us some of your valuable time, and we look forward to the lecture. So without further ado, I pass on the mic to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for inviting me. I gave my last speech at the RBI when I visited St. Stephen's College. I think it was my last day. I have very good memories of that visit. So I'm back once again, this time virtually. And again, I want to speak about economics, but this time around, I want to add the political aspect. Now, I'm not a political scientist, but certainly I have had the benefit of seeing political economy play out in policy making in India and across the world. And I really believe that critical to our economic future is the need to strengthen our democracy and its institutions. If we can do that, our future is limitless. If, however, we allow our liberal democracy to deteriorate into populist, majoritarian authoritarianism, it's not just your economic future that will be jeopardized, but our soul as a nation and our place in the community of nations. Many of you, the youth of India, have the ability to rectify our course, but it requires you to draw on your innate idealism rather than succumb to the self-interest and the cynical opportunism that so many of my generation have given into. In the rest of my speech, I will try and expand on this and give you a sense of why I think the possibilities are limitless for India, but we have to choose carefully. If you look around yourself today, you'll hear a lot of noise about India rebounding, and it certainly is doing that with strong growth numbers. Any growth should, of course, be celebrated, but we cannot ignore the fact that the rebound is from disastrous numbers posted last fiscal year. Our poorest citizens, and especially their children, have suffered the most during the pandemic and continue to suffer with a K-shaped recovery. And for those who don't know, the K-shape means some in the economy are doing particularly well, others doing particularly badly, typically the poorer segments. The scarring of our lower middle class households and MSMEs will mean that the domestic demand, once we get past this initial rebound, will remain subdued. And it also means that even with strong growth in fiscal year 22-23, the one we're currently going to enter, we will still be significantly below our pre-pandemic trend line. Now, our slow growth is not all the fault of the pandemic. Our underperformance predates the pandemic. Indeed, we have been underperforming our potential for over a decade, probably since the onset of the global financial crisis. And the key measure of this underperformance is our inability to create the good jobs that all of you need. Many of you have read of the 12 million applicants for 35,000 railway jobs. Some of you may be those applicants. Another aspect of this same tragedy is that so many of our youth while away the best years of their life sitting for exams for government jobs until they become too old to sit anymore. Most worrisome is that we have a scarcity of jobs even when so many of our women are not working outside the house. Female labor force participation in India was among the lowest in the G20 at 20.3% in 2019. It was then about as low as Saudi Arabia. But since then, Saudi Arabia has reformed and its female labor force participation is over 33% today. So we're lagging on that dimension, even behind Saudi Arabia. Think how much richer we would be as a country and how much less frustrated our youth would be if there were good jobs for all. And so we have to ask the question, where have we gone wrong? Before answering that, let me emphasize that as a country, we've had successes, no doubt. For the 2 decades after the 1991 reforms, we had 7% average growth, something very few large countries have achieved. So this is a very credit-worthy achievement. And even over the last decade of relatively slow growth, India's had some notable successes. With just some examples, we are the largest two-wheeler manufacturer in the world, exporting classic Enfield motorcycles to the land of the Harley-Davidson. If you think about fintech, the Aadhaar stack and its applications, such as the Universal Payment Interface or UPI, are digitizing the daily lives of our citizens. We now have over 4 billion transactions a month on UPI. We started UPI in 2016 when I was at the RBI, 7 years before the equivalent FedNow, which the Federal Reserve will operationalize in the United States only in 2023. So we were 7 years before the Fed. UPI system is now being studied across the world by central banks intending to implement fast retail payments. In a similar vein, ISRO has put India on the space map at a fraction of the amount spent by other nations. And of course, our expat Indians have done wonderfully well. On a good day for Microsoft stock, Satya Nadella runs the richest company in the world. So if India and Indians have so much potential and have achieved so much in the past and elsewhere, why are we faltering now? And I will argue in this talk that it's not the fault of our people, but a failure of imagination of our politics and leadership. What has worked for us in the past are well thought out, well thought through frameworks or infrastructure that free our people to utilize their creativity and enterprise. For example, Prime Minister Vajpayee's Golden Quadrilateral Highway Building Program opened up and connected India. The rural roads programs of subsequent governments have built on this. And when a Pakka road connects a village to the rest of India, it does wonders for the village economy. Overnight, dairy and poultry farming take off because milk, eggs, and chicken can now be transported to markets. Shops start stocking the latest goods. Development starts occurring before your eyes as jobs are created and people's energies are unleashed. Now, the past emphasis on hard infrastructure was supported by efforts to improve schooling and the skilling of our workforce, and the steady liberalization of tariffs and regulations to render our economy more competitive. Our citizens' control over government was also strengthened by acts like the UPA's Right to Information Act. The Aadhaar stack, again started during the UPA time, allowed the state, the private sector, and citizens to do much more digitally. All this contributed to that 7% growth I talked about. But the fall off in growth over the last decade raises the question of whether we need to go in an entirely new direction or focus on deepening or broadening reforms. Now, of course, at this time, it's useful to ask, what is the current government's vision? And it seems to center around the term Atmanirbhar, or self-reliance. In some ways, it seems to be a continuation of the recent past. In its recent budget, the central government emphasizes better connectivity and logistics and devotes significant resources to it. That is good. Yet in many ways, Atmanirbhar also seems to be a reversion to a more distant and failed past. As one example, the budget barely mentions the tragedy that is overtaking our school children, especially the poor ones. Many, not having been to school for 2 years, are dropping out of school. There are few extra resources being devoted to rescuing a potentially lost generation, and this is a serious omission. But more worrisome is the budget also raises tariffs and further increases production subsidies to big industry, what one might call a sin of commission. Perhaps the central government thinks state governments will take care of the children, and that is why it hasn't allocated too much in the way of resources. Indeed, the state of Tamil Nadu, which I work with, has come up with an innovative scheme to hire 1.75 lakh local workers to offer children remedial learning and draw them gently back into school without sort of piling on a huge amount of schoolwork on them immediately. Alarmingly, the Department of Education in Tamil Nadu finds that over 5 lakh children had dropped out, and these are now being coaxed back. I don't believe Tamil Nadu is the worst affected state, but far worse affected states are doing nothing, perhaps because such schemes cost money. So it raises the question, should the central budget have directed more money to our lost children than production incentives for our biggest industrialists? Before answering that question, however, let's delve deeper into the government's rationale, because it's unfair to take pot shots without understanding the rationale better. I said India had grown strongly, but there's one large country that has done even better, and that is, of course, China. As recently as 1995, China and India were neck to neck in per capita GDP. Today, the PPP dollar terms per capita GDP for China is $17,200, and it's $6,390 for India, about a third China's size. Now, the vision that can be gleaned from this budget is that India wants to become a manufacturing export powerhouse that will replicate China's success. And this is certainly no small vision. The question, however, we must ask is the China path even feasible for India? Think about how China achieved its growth. It was initially achieved by suppressing wages and consumption and keeping borrowing costs in check so that firms would get cheap credit. And this was done by paying low interest rates to households. So households were suppressed twice. First, they got lower wages. Second, they received low interest rates on their savings. Now, over time, households benefited because China created a more educated workforce, decent infrastructure, reduced tariffs, and per capita incomes zoomed. But our starting point is different. It is impossible, as also undesirable, for a democracy like India to directly suppress worker wages, as also to suppress household savings rates. There's no way we can do it. So the government has been trying to promote manufacturing, partly through better logistics as promised in this budget, which I like, but primarily through higher tariffs and production subsidies for large manufacturers. And the argument for this is an old one. It is that, as the Ministry of Technology website suggests, or of Electronics website suggests, the electronics sector suffers a comparative disadvantage of around 8.5% to 11%, because India has inadequate infrastructure, high cost of finance, inadequate availability of quality power, limited design capabilities, and inadequacies in worker skills. So all these deficiencies are sought to be compensated for by first elevating tariffs to protect industry, but also raising subsidies to industry so that they can compete. So in other words, the argument is industry needs protection to produce, and the range of industries that need protection grow in every budget. Lakhs of crores will be spent in subsidies. This is very different from the 1990 reforms, which was about liberalizing the economy and forcing competition on industry which had been uncompetitive for decades because they had been protected. We are going back to protection. Now, we failed at that time for straightforward reasons. A tariff on inputs is a tax on exports. Indeed, when you look at a recent study of mobile phone manufacturing in India, it suggests the production cost increases from the tariffs because tariffs are being levied on some inputs, completely offsets any subsidies. And that renders the effectiveness of the entire PLI scheme in encouraging exports a little less effective. Furthermore, if you want to bring in manufacturers for exports, this constant rejigging of tariffs, as in this budget, discourages investment. Global manufacturers will fear any export-oriented investment could be disrupted by some well-connected domestic lobby wrangling a tariff on an input. And we saw a range of inputs attracting tariffs, including capital equipment in this budget. Also, which industries get production-linked subsidies is non-transparent and completely discretionary, leading to the possibility that taxpayer money goes to subsidize the well-connected rather than sectors where India may have a natural advantage. Now, I don't want to sound pessimistic. Every idea, and this is an idea that the government has had, needs consideration. But let us remember to eventually be competitive without subsidies that come from our taxpayer, without tariffs that hurt our consumer, we actually have to fix all the deficiencies that the government itself recognizes. In the meantime, we'll be locked into a pattern of subsidizing our biggest firms while ignoring other pressing concerns. But clearly, we have limited budgetary resources, and the lack of attention to schooling in the budget, while PLI schemes are allocated lakhs of crores, is certainly consistent with my concern. Now, whether we fix the deficiencies or not, as we learned with the license permit Raj that we demolished in 1990-91, firms get used to tariffs and subsidies and will lobby vigorously to retain them even when the scheme is supposed to end, thus imposing higher costs all around. Already, if you see, a number of firms are lobbying for schemes to be extended to compensate for the pandemic period in which they could not manufacture as much. Perhaps the most worrisome concern, however, is not to do with the past, is not to do with the way we're going about it, but that even if we are successful, there's no place for a second China. Any manufacturing export-led growth strategy today faces protectionism from developed countries. They're extremely reluctant to accept another China, storming its way into their domestic markets and decimating the small town manufacturers that still survive. In other words, we are going to experience much more protectionism than China did, which makes a manufacturing-led export growth strategy much less viable. Now, there is an alternative path, however, building on the old vision we had in the 1990s of increasing openness and liberalization. And that path draws on India's people, their minds and their creativity, but also on our liberal democracy. It caters to demand in the much larger global market, thus allowing India to get rich fast by producing for others. But instead of focusing on exporting goods, we should emphasize the export of services, where we already have a strong presence and some learned advantages. Now, this is not to say that we shouldn't build out infrastructure or discourage our manufacturers from seeking out new markets, though we should encourage them not through protective tariffs and subsidies, but by remedying our deficiencies, again, one part of which the budget tries to do. However, let's place our emphasis on leapfrogging the manufacturing stage that countries go through and going directly to high quality services. Put differently, if we have a choice, we certainly should choose both learning and logistics. But if we don't have a choice, we've got to pick one or the other, we should pick the learning of our children, of our workers, over creating more logistics. That is where we should put more resources. Now, let me explain a little more why I think the environment has changed to favor service exports and why India has an advantage in doing more of that. First, as you know, and as we experience right now, the pandemic has made it easy to provide high value-added services at a distance. If a consultant can work from home in Chicago to service clients in Austin, why can't she do the same from Hyderabad, servicing clients in Chicago or in Austin? The market for services like consulting, legal and financial advice, education, edtech, telemedicine, all these are ripe for globalization. And services delivered online, unlike goods, do not cross a physical border where they can be stopped. Moreover, the United States is the largest exporter of services in the world, and Europe collectively is not far behind. They themselves will be hurt if they push rising protectionism in services, and they have an incentive instead to push in the opposite direction. India has another advantage here, its liberal democracy. A key element in providing services is shared values and trust, especially around the data that is harvested. You've heard talk of data being the new oil, but that's a very valuable resource. Now, people worry about authoritarian countries like China and Russia owning their data. And this puts those countries at a disadvantage. I mean, think about it. No customer cares where they're buying a vacuum cleaner from, so long as it works well. But if they're asked to share their medical or financial data or their firm's strategy, they care very much about privacy, about data protection. Will the provider protect their data? Will the provider's government snoop or use the data to blackmail them? It helps if the provider comes from a transparent and tolerant democracy that is driven by rule of law. So that's the second reason why, with our democracy, we have an advantage in services. A final reason is to do with the world itself, which wants to grow green. It's impossible for the world to grow its consumption of goods at the pace of the past, or for many developing countries today to consume eventually at the level that a rich US household consumes today. We have to be more frugal. And more of the consumption basket will increasingly consist of services, even for moderate income countries. So if we're thinking decades ahead, thinking about the consumption basket, which consists much more of services than goods, would it not make more sense to lay more of our eggs in the services basket? So that is my pitch for focusing on services, becoming the first economy to grow into middle income based on service exports. Of course, there are lots of services needed by our own economy, and there will be a fair amount of manufacturing, but when we talk emphasis, I would suggest services rather than manufacturing. This raises two questions. Will there be high quality service jobs? Clearly not everyone can do them right now because we have different levels of education, but will those jobs then provide jobs for the rest? That's question one. And second, if we do want to go about this service-led growth, what do we need to do differently? So let's first start with, will there be sufficient jobs? Now, what I'm talking about here are not replacing the jobs in the economy, but adding new thrust areas. The old jobs will not go away. But how do we ensure there are many more new ones? And I think if you think about the sectors where we're trying to raise our profile, raise exports, there certainly could be a lot more jobs. Consider education. In many high-skilled services, only a recognized degree and trust stops people like you from serving the world. Many students from India go do a finishing degree abroad and then join a high-powered consulting firm or a legal firm, or join hospitals around the world. So quality higher education is a must, and we can provide it in India itself. And that will provide the high-quality degree to many more of our youth. But we can also provide the degree to the rest of the world, to students from our neighbors, students from Africa, students from the Middle East, students from Southeast Asia to begin with, and eventually, why not teach the West, teach Japan? If these students from around the world have a good experience, they become our ambassadors, just like the Indian diaspora is, and we build networks around us, which are networks on trade, business, as also culture. We can also as I argued earlier, deliver education into people's homes around the world. Some of our edtech firms are trying to do that. And each of these edtech firms can create many more jobs, high quality jobs for people like the software assisted tutors who now work in many edtech firms. And when you think about jobs as teachers, jobs as educators, jobs as tutors, these are high-paying jobs, and each one of these creates 4 or 5 more jobs for the less skilled. Every school, university, or edtech platform not only creates jobs for teachers and tutors, but also jobs for clerical staff, coaches, cooks, cleaners, ground staff, and security guards. Now, you don't want people to settle for those kinds of jobs in the longer run. Our ambition should be to make everyone capable of getting the good jobs while automating the hard, unskilled ones. But there will be a period of transition, and during this period of transition, we can create many more jobs than just the high-quality jobs. Now, these are just the possibilities in education. Think of the possibilities in medicine, both with telemedicine as well as medical tourism, treating patients in India. Think about fintech. Think about consultancy, legal services, and add to all that more traditional services like travel and tourism, which tend to be very employment intensive. Think of all the people working in our hotels, our restaurants, our airlines, our railways, and so on. The point I'm trying to make is we can be the first nation that transitions directly to services without going through a substantial period of emphasis on manufacturing. Now, is this easily feasible? And that's the second question. What do we need to do differently? And clearly, we have some deficiencies if we go on this path. It's not that this path is easier than the manufacturing-led path. It just is more sustainable in the longer run, in my view. A service-led path will require us to have many more people with high-quality capabilities, people like those that are listening to this talk. So we have to put people first. That's the first aspect. Second, we need a government that is more pragmatic, transparent, decentralized, and open to challenge. That's the kind of government that can engage in a service-led economy. So in other words, we need a learning government that is able to chart this new path, which doesn't sort of go on tried and tested paths, but is willing to push forward in new ways. Third, the world order has to be made much more hospitable to trade in services. It has been focused on trade and manufacturing so far, but there are a number of things I'll come to in a second, which are needed to make the world more hospitable to trade in services. And India certainly has to lead in this process because it benefits significantly. And so India has to formulate agendas rather than reacting to global agendas as it has in the past. So given the limits of time, let me sketch each of these fairly quickly and then conclude. First, I said put people first. Now, in order to draw from our best talent, and services requires that we use our best talent, we have to give everyone a chance, starting from our biggest minority, which is women, but continuing to religious minorities and disadvantaged castes and tribes. There are people who want to discriminate, but in this day, a discriminatory society is not just immoral, it is weak because it is internally divided and it has few friends in the community of democracies. And since these will be our target markets, we cannot be seen as creating second-class citizens. Nothing has riled the Western society more about China, prompting sanctions and boycotts, than its treatment of Uyghurs. We don't want to be in that park. Now, so first, be inclusive, be fair, offer widespread and equal opportunity. That certainly is what we have to do. Second, people, even the very poor, often know what is best for them. We must empower them to seek out better futures for their children. So if we want to improve education, we want to improve healthcare, we also need to trust the people in addition to putting them first. Direct cash transfers, which the government has used a lot of, are often a powerful means of empowerment, and we need to work on making them more effective, more targeted, and more efficient. Now, Thirdly, government is sometimes unresponsive to local or individual need. And one remedy of overly unresponsive government is to decentralize government. And I'll come to that in a minute. A second is to place much greater weight on individual rights and freedoms and push courts to enforce them. Often it is thought that rights and freedoms are things that only Loiten's Delhi talks about. It's for the upper class elite. The worst abuse of freedom is often experienced by the poor, by the weak, by those who are uneducated. And we really need to change this. Government is most oppressive at the bottom. And we need to push for more individual rights and freedoms and push courts to enforce them. For that, we have to also allow criticism. Routinely, central and state authorities suppress critics and prevent change by using draconian acts like UAPA, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. Far from protecting the public from criminals and terrorists, the act is often misused to protect the lazy, the incompetent, and the motivated in government from the public. We need to change this. And it's not just this government, past governments have enshrined and protected this act. We need to reform it. Second, we need, as I said, a government that learns, because a service-led growth path into middle income is not something that has been attempted before. There is no guidebook for us. We have to make it up as we go, which means the government has to learn by experimenting, first at small scale, then rolling out more widely, sharing data both on its successes and failures, and listening to its critics. What this will prevent is decisions from being taken impulsively by a small coterie without much thought or reflection. Instead, decisions will be arrived through debate in cabinet, in parliament, and various fora, and eventually a consensus reached which can be implemented. What this also requires is data should not be suppressed. Instead, we should collect data on all aspects of government performance in a transparent and verifiable way and make data widely available. This helps the government because as the data are analyzed, the government understands where it's going wrong. And that means, in addition, we need to protect free speech and criticism so that the powerful can correct decisions quickly as those decisions are analyzed and criticized, rather than simply hearing praise even when decisions are obviously wrong. One of the reasons we go off track is simply we don't have course correction in inadequate time. India also, as I said, needs effective decentralization. And this is not just decentralization from the center to the states, but also from the states to municipalities and panchayats. And decentralization means, in the jargon, devolving functions, that is powers, funds, that is money, and functionaries, that is people, employees, to not just from the center to the state, but from states to the local government. Now, what that does allow is every locality to listen to the people and their needs locally and conduct its own experiments in policy that would be more suitable to that particular locality than would a centrally set policy. It also allows a wide variety of experiments so that localities can learn from each other. A district in Karnataka can learn how a district in Punjab has been successful, or a municipality in Punjab has been successful in raising finance. And therefore, we can learn from each other. It also gives local people a much greater sense of control over their destiny because they can see their local functionary frequently, participate in policy making, and even have a say in rewarding a functionary for good performance. In other words, rather than just being called upon to vote every 5 years, they can participate in governance and see it as it affects their daily lives. One example, if the village teacher or headmaster is employed not by the state government, but by the panchayat, then think of the control parents in the panchayat can have over the teacher's behavior, instead of being at the mercy of the teacher because it's the state government that pays her salary and the state government which determines her terms of employment, and the locals have no say in either rewarding her if she does a really good job or penalizing her if she never shows up in school. So more localization would help tremendously. Last point I want to make before I close is we need to lead global change towards services. And that means, let me give you a couple of examples of what we might need. Service-led exports might require, if we're talking about telemedicine, might require medical degrees to be recognized elsewhere so that the doctor here can prescribe for a patient in California because the degree is recognized. Now, that is something we can negotiate for in international agreements. Come, look at our All India institutes, look at AFMC and so on, and certify them as meeting international standards. Not only will that elevate the standards of our schools a little more, not that the AIMS needs elevation, but it will also, in some sense, open the doorway for our students to be able to work anywhere while living in India. Now, telemedicine from India would be even easier if Medicare, Medicaid, these are the insurance programs in the US, and the National Health Service in the UK paid for treatment provided from India. So that again would require negotiation by the government. Instead of talking constantly about manufacturing tariffs and agricultural subsidies, let's talk services. Let's talk about how we can find it easier to export our services. So these kinds of different areas of emphasis need to be part of our negotiating stance on international agreements. And we are going to be the president of the G20 soon. Why not set this as part of the agenda and start the world debating on these issues? Now, that's as far as influencing the world goes. Domestically, we need laws and frameworks in many new areas. For instance, the world worries about data protection and privacy, and fears intrusive actions by hostile foreign governments accessing their citizens' data. So when we enact our privacy laws, let's not do it mimicking China and say government has to look at everything and have no privacy for anybody under any circumstances. Let's understand best practices in the democratic world and pick and choose how we can reassure the world that our firms will respect the privacy of not just domestic consumers, domestic users, but also foreign customers, and that their data will be safe, not just from the firm itself, but also from our own government. We need checks and balances to convince the world that we can be relied upon. And finally, we need to convince the world that we'll be accountable as a country. When we do more business with the world, we simply have to respect the contracts we sign. And our courts should have the power and the will to enforce them, even if it means sometimes going against the government. That is what is meant by rule of law. And it is important if we want to prevail in global trade and services, we should respect the rule of law. So let me conclude. I am calling for an Indian way. Let's not mimic the China way. We're not an authoritarian country, and we should not be one. We are a democratic country, and we should be embarking on an Indian growth path that draws on the capabilities of all Indians, bar none, and builds on India's strength of tolerance and respect for all, which makes the idea of India so loved the world over. I'm calling for a path that builds on India's unique democracy, not just the fact that we have regular elections. Many other countries have that, but that the argumentative Indian can debate and criticize, that we can have ideas that are diametrically opposite to that of the governments. It is our democratic nature that will make us trusted by the citizens everywhere else in the world. Finally, I'm calling for India to become a Vishwaguru, not just on the basis of the ideas of the past, but because it has a new vision of green, inclusive growth and development and persuades the world of its vision. In other words, I'm calling for us all to put the politics back into economics, not to divide, but to unite and to take us to a better future. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much, sir. That was indeed an insightful session. If there are any questions, yes, there are people who have raised their hands already. As I mentioned before, please also send the questions to the questions moderator if there is any issues in raising your hand.
I'm guessing the questions moderator will ask me the question, right?
Vishak, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, sir. My question is, like you said, that no one wants to see a second China, which destroys their local manufacturers. So, according to you, what would be some positive steps that India could take where we can actually skip the manufacturing economy part and actually move more towards a service-based economy?
Well, I talked about some of them, right? So let me not repeat them. Instead, what I will say is a important question that should be on your minds is, why is services less protectionist? And I think services is fairly protectionist, but we can work on breaking down those protectionist barriers. For example, a doctor from India has to go and undergo exam in a different country if they want to qualify. Now, that's a barrier to practicing across the world. But we can bring down that barrier by asking richer countries, well, why not make this exam more widely available? Why do you have to travel to California to give the exam? Can we give the exam just like we give the SAT or the GRE across the world? Then our doctors can become qualified. They certainly are very good doctors. The world likes them, but they can be qualified to practice in other countries also. That breaks down one barrier to services, but we've got to work on it. We got to work on it. We cannot simply assume they will do it. And there will be quid pro quos. We will need to import a lot of manufacturing goods as we grow. So the quid pro quo could be, we allow your services easier entry. We allow your manufacturing easier entry. But we need to do our homework to do that kind of discussion, to have that kind of quid pro quo.
Okay, Tarun, you may ask your question.
Yes, thank you so much. Good morning, sir. So my question is that it is commonly agreed that the implementation of policies depends more upon the state governments rather than the central government. And there is always a dispute between the center and the states over the distribution of funds, for example, the release of GST arrears. So how can the states and the center arrive at a harmonious working relationship so that they can equally divide the funds and utilize them for growth and development?
Well, this is what was called cooperative federalism, right? And typically leaders at the center, when they are in the state, will call for more cooperative federalism. Somehow it seems to vanish when they get it to the center. It needs trust on both sides. It needs trust on both sides. It needs actual cooperation, but also help. So one example where cooperative federalism breaks down is the center typically, and this is not just this government, other governments have done it in the past, will term a tax assess. As soon as they term it assess, they don't have to share it with the states in the way that the Finance Commission requires every tax to be shared. So that's a way of keeping the funds that are raised for the center itself. And of course, the more you do this, the states say, this is not fair. You're playing fast and loose with the terms of the Finance Commission. Similarly, the Finance Commission is supposed to say how funds will be distributed between the center and the state. But with the right manipulation, the center can, in a sense, evade what the Finance Commission has asked them to do. And therefore, the states then feel aggrieved. This is not a fair process. The Finance Commission said we would get 42% of the tax receipts. And what we've got coming in is 35% because we found all sorts of ways to keep it from us. So what we need is respect the institutions we've set up, such as the Finance Commission. Don't skew the Finance Commission towards the center, but also build trust with the states in a variety of ways. Can't say anything better than that. We do need to work in a cooperative way, and you're absolutely right. The center and the states cannot be at loggerheads.
Thank you, sir.
We've got some questions in the chat box. Devojit, if you can please speak up and ask one of those.
Yeah, sure. So one of the questions was, in your article, the end of free lunch economics, you talked about how the paycheck protection program, which was supposed to provide relief to the small businesses, ended up benefiting the top 1/5 of the earners. How would one go about addressing a similar issue in the case of India, where most of the small businesses are in the unorganized sector and do not have a good insurance penetration to help the businesses get past the losses?
Yeah, I mean, this is again not an easy task, right? I think the first thing you have to keep in mind is that any kind of program, and we have some programs which have been structured since the pandemic, but you have to be careful that any kind of program doesn't go out to bail out our banks. That if what is happening is money is going through the front door to the MSME as a new loan, which is guaranteed by the government, but goes out through the back door to bail out the bank and have its loan repaid, eventually you're not helping the MSME. And I worry about some of our programs that if they're structured like the PPE, they're blanket guarantees of the bank loans, that effectively what is happening is some of the bank loans themselves are effectively being repaid with government money. Now, if you can assure that that's not happening, then you want to try and help the viable MSMEs. You can't help everybody. And where you have one-man operations, try and help the person through free food grains, through some kind of NREGA, unemployment insurance in the rural areas, things like that. But don't try and protect every small farm. Some are simply not viable, and you won't be able. If you pour more money into them, they'll typically go to pay landlords, bankers, and so on. So once you've done that sort of analysis, which are the MSMEs that you can help, then try and create programs which give them additional funding so that they can survive the period of the pandemic and can come back. Now, some of this may require restructuring some of their debts down the line, having a speedy restructuring system, and so on. We need to put that in place in order to benefit some of the MSMEs that are viable but are struggling because of all the payments they have to make. But this is a whole program which has to be structured, and I hope we haven't been following what we've done, but I hope we've done some of it.
Right. We have another question. Indian voters are said to put more stock in patronage, populism, or parochialism. However, since 2000, in many elections, there have been increasing electoral runs to governments that deliver higher economic growth. Indian voters are rewarding politicians for good economic performance. Can this be viewed as a new and encouraging sign that Indian democracy is maturing? How far are we saying good economics mean good politics in India?
I'm not sure that there's clear evidence in the way the questioner is suggesting. I think in some states there's a tradition of chucking out the incumbent and replacing them with someone else. I mean, the state of Tamil Nadu, there's been a back and forth quite some time. In other states, maybe it's based more on performance, but you have to ask performance compared to what? Some states have re-elected the same government for quite some time without necessarily, an overwhelming sense of good performance. So, and it need not only be economic performance. I think voters care about a whole lot of other things, including, for example, safety and security, but sometimes just pride, pride for caste, pride for religion, pride for other things. So the voter, I would not be, I would not say the voter is maturing. I think our voters have been mature for a long time. I just think they put different emphasis at different times based on the need of the hour, how they think, the average citizen will be benefited. And so I would not go so far as to say it's only economics, and that's very clear going forward.
Thank you so much, sir. So we've got another question in the chat box. In a country like India, we often see clear signs of political budget cycles as the government introduces majority of the welfare schemes just before the elections in both the central and the state government. But India is also a country known for its anti-incumbency feeling. So do you think in a country like India, these cycles actually influence the voters, and if they do, at what cost? Is the cost of this higher in India as compared to other countries?
It's a good question. Look, I don't know that it influences the voters. I do know it's done. And I do know that politicians, once it's done, regret having made those promises because they find their budgets are totally shattered after that. I remember when I was RBI governor, we used to keep saying, don't do loan waivers, because loan waivers are a blanket use of the state's resources, which give you no funds after the waiver to actually invest, to help technological upgradation, do all the things that governments have to. And I remember in my time, at least 2 governments declared complete loan waivers, and then came to the RBI and said, please help us now. We announced it, we couldn't do anything else, but now we need your help in order to make it less onerous for our state budgets, etc. And what can you do at such a time except say, look, I told you, don't do it. And now you've done it, and you want to find ways of hiding the costs. The reality is, some populism is needed, but there's a lot of populism which is excessive, right? So, for example, one aspect of populism which was needed is the midday meal for children. I think that was something that was very effective in bringing kids to school, giving them at least one good meal a day, and allowing them to learn on at least a full stomach during the day, even if that stomach went empty at night. I think that, if I recall, it was Dr. M.G. Ramachandran who first implemented it, but it went around India. And I think that was a good thing in terms of benefiting our long-run future by improving education as well as nutrition. There are other populist measures which are less well targeted and very wasteful, and eventually end up hurting the citizen because the state doesn't have enough funds to do things that are necessary. So I wouldn't say all populism is bad. I would say we need to be careful about excessive populism.
Okay, by the way, if any of the faculty members have any questions, they may ask it now. And in that case, there is one more question in that box. If the Indian government is decentralized and runs on local government, how would that ensure economic growth if every state is working on their own rules and policies?
I think that is misunderstanding the point about local government. This is not to say every policy is decentralized to the local level, right? Instead, what you want to do is follow what is called the principle of subsidiarity. Have a policy, so have a power at the lowest level that can exercise it effectively. So it would be ridiculous to decentralize defense. Defense has to be a federal government or a central government task, because that's something that everybody benefits from and requires central planning, et cetera, et cetera. So, you would not locate defense at the local level. But, monitoring of teachers, that is something that can be done at the local level. Why have the sort of teacher being compensated at the state capital without much of a sense of whether they're doing a good job or not? After all, local parents, local students know better what kind of job the teacher is doing. So why can't the local panchayat have the right, at the very least, to reward or on occasion penalize the teacher, if not determine the entire terms of salary and condition. Actually, Tamil Nadu used to have much more decentralized monitoring of teachers in the past. And that worked pretty well. So we have examples in India of more localization of powers. Over time, powers have, first post-independence, we didn't think there was a need for a third layer of government. So powers were divided between the state and the center. After Panchayati Raj, after the emergence of municipalities, states have been reluctant to give more powers to the localities, more funding to the localities. And that has to happen. Every state has a state finance commission. They should use it more effectively to push more powers down. That will allow a lot more local empowerment, which I think will be good.
Puna ma'am, I'm so sorry. I didn't notice that you raised your hand. You may ask now.
So thank you. Actually, it was similar to the question that was asked previously, sir. So really, what's stopping the states not passing on the funds to the local government if they face the same, problems with the center? I mean, they're doing to the local governments what they face from the center. I really thought what's stopping them. I realized it's trust.
Precisely what's stopping the center. Nobody wants to let go of powers or funds. And what I'm saying is, if we want to be governed better, we need that. That's what we have to propose and fight for, a decentralization. I mean, the state of Uttar Pradesh, right, is 2/3 the size of the United States in terms of population. And it's one state governed from the center. The US has 50 states. So, and each of these 50 states has a ton of counties. Each county has its own leadership. There are lots of towns. Each town has a mayor. When policies are set at the state capital for what is really a country, you don't get a lot of local sensitivity. And as a result, I think we get poor governance when we shouldn't. Another aspect I didn't mention is we have too few functionaries. If you aggregate the government people in India, we think we're a big bureaucracy, right? Too many people in government. It turns out when you look at the people in government to population ratio, we're actually quite small. And that's because we don't have much in the way of local government. In many other countries, that's where people are because they're there helping the ordinary citizen do things. That's where policies like vaccinations, etc., are rolled out. And we need to think about it as something which perhaps now that we've become so big, we're 3 times what we were at independence in population size. Do we need the same structure that we had in independence, or do we need a more decentralized structure?
Ananya Acharya, you may go now.
Hello, sir. Thank you for the insightful session. Sir, I had a question for you. While you were mentioning about the service-driven economy, I checked the upper secondary education rates, which average around at 40%. This is the population which will certainly plug in being the global service provider. But my question for you is, how do we upskill and restructure the system to incorporate the majority population which has been educated till lower secondary education, till lower secondary school, and encourage the EdTech to strengthen the education system?
Look, I don't have easy answers. This is a difficult task, and we need to do better at it. I would say that it's a combination of new ideas as well as resources, as well as better incentives in the system for all the providers. So whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, we certainly need to do a better job. I have no doubt about that. The precise ways we will do it, I'm going to say, we can spend the next few hours talking about what changes are needed in the education system, what changes are needed in the healthcare system. And it would be good to involve a whole bunch of experts also in that discussion. So we have a long ways to go. But there are experiments being run around India on how to improve school education, how to improve college education. Right now, I'm engaged in a new university in the south called Korea, and we're trying to change the way we teach the kids there, have a more fluid curriculum, have a way of a more liberal education where the kids are not mainstreamed into one narrow track early on, but learn various things, including how to write, including computer languages, and then get streamed into a specific subject like physics or math or economics down the line. In the same way as there are experiments on higher education, there are experiments in schooling. Lots of experiments on how to produce, higher quality education. And in a sense, the time to produce higher quality education is now. We get most of our kids into school at an early age. The problem is the quality of education is not good enough to make them stay. And so the dropout rate is very high, the point that you were referring to. How do we improve quality? And how do we sort of engage some of these new technologies, some of which have been rolled out during the pandemic, in a way as to bring the highest quality education to the poorest children? These are things we need to debate, but we need to do a better job, no doubt.
Right. Thank you, sir.
Okay, we have a last question here. How would decentralization to local governments really play out for India? In the example you gave, an ability for people to choose teachers in the neighborhood school, exercise check on them would ideally empower people. In rural India, politics is heavily dominated by caste relations and strongman politics. Teaching positions controlled by local bodies might mean greater scope for politically connected teachers to stay on, or people with the resources to buy their way into the job for a plum salary. How can we be sure it works? Democracy in India never has been anything close to ideal. How far can we rely on our unique political system to move us to a different economic path? Is the political structure really conducive to the kind of liberal economic values that you think are essential for the different approach you suggest? Has it ever been?
You're cynical at too young an age, but cynicism is sometimes useful. I think you're asking the right question. How do you make sure that the corruption that exists at the state level doesn't transfer to the local level? But let's be clear, it's not as if there's no corruption at the state level either. So in a system which is flawed, the question is, how can we get a system that is better than the existing system? And this is why I'm saying we need experimentation. Maybe the idea is not to do the hiring at the local level, but have some rewards and some punishments at the local level. That's one example. Maybe the idea is to have an exam. Maybe the idea is that you don't have even the recruiting at the state level, have a central level of recruiting. I mean, there are lots of ways you can think about this, lots of ways you can cut it. The point I'm trying to make, and you're saying the locals are disempowered. I'm saying yes, therefore give them some power. Don't say they disempowered, therefore we will not empower them at all. Even if the power is grabbed by the local elites, at least it's a move in the right direction. They know there is power that they can get and they can fight for it. The experience of India is that the downtrodden continuously gain more power over time. The so-called scheduled castes used to be ignored, but they have gained power over time. They have learned how to work the political system in a better way than they used to in the past. And that's been a good thing in elevating their opportunities. And I think what we should do is give the process a chance in a pragmatic way. I'm not saying be naive, be idealistic, ignore the potential for local elites, but put in place checks and balances. And if you do it the right way, and let me assure you, the same dialogue goes on in the US. Or you give power to the local areas, they'll be racist. They would teach, they will say that you can't teach evolution. They'll become Christian radicals. Every country thinks the locals cannot be trusted. I would say, give them a chance and then see what happens and change the system as it goes. I'm not saying that you go naively and change it dramatically without thinking about the consequences, but change it in a way that can harness the energies of the local people, and I think we would be better off.
Hello. Thank you so much, sir. Unfortunately, we have reached the end of the Q&A session. I request the staff advisor Poonam ma'am to come up and give the vote of thanks.
Thank you so much, sir, for your time. This was really a very tight set of arguments. Your first sentence, you want things, how to answer that question, and the next sentence had the answer. You know, there were no loose ends. It was really tight, and we kind of have raised a dream for us, like this can be done. Because most of the time we talk about the manufacturing sector being left behind, how jobs are not getting created. You know, this is a completely different perspective, and the fact that you pinned out all the things that need to be done, that there's always going to be a lot of work to be done, but you've shown us the way. This means a lot to us. It's been radical. And also the fact that in spite of being a talk on politics and economics, it was not ideologically colored. You know, this can be done. Like, it's so impossible to have somebody come over and not leak out their ideological bent while talking about politics. I mean, we don't know where you belong on that scale, thanks to a beautiful balance you've been able to maintain, throughout the lecture. We can't thank you enough also for being in a different time zone and spending your night actually with us. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot.
Well, thanks for having me, and good luck with your festival. Thank you.
I think he's left.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Hitakshi, but you can go and please give the vote of thanks.
Yes. So good morning to everyone present here. On behalf of the Economic Society, St. Stephen's College, I deem it a great honor to extend my heartiest thanks to our revered speaker, Dr. Raghuram Rajan, who bestowed us with insightful information about the importance of politics for economics in today's world. I am sure every one of us is delighted by your knowledge and presence. I would also like to express my sincere gratitude to our principal, Professor John Varghese, and bursar, Dr. Gaite, who gave us the opportunity to organize this insightful lecture as a part of the National Economics Festival. I would also like to deeply thank our HOD, Mr. Sanjeev Grewal, for his presence, and our staff advisor, Ms. Poonam Kalra, for her constant support and motivation in all our endeavors. We would also like to thank all the senior members for taking out time to join today's event. We extend a heartfelt gratitude to Prof. Grey Matter for sponsoring the event. Unpaid thanks to our audience for their active participation. Thank you everybody for joining, and we hope you had a great time.
Thank you so much. It was so insightful.
Thank you.